Welcome back to my channel. I'm Traben, and in today's video we're going to be doing a review for Brandon Sanderson's Wind and Truth, the 5th book in the Stormlight Archives. I don't think I'm going to be able to hold this up the entire video. I'm going to start with spoiler-free review at the beginning of this video, and then we'll get into spoilers at the end. I'll try to make it abundantly clear when I'm getting into spoilers. The short of it is that I liked this book. I do feel like it resolved what it needed to for the first arc in the Stormlight Archives. It still received a 4 out of 5, but it's a very tenuous 4. It's like a 3-5 rounded up. So we're going to talk about some issues I've had with the series and issues I had with this book in particular. But like I said, I want to start off kind of broad and vague, and I'm setting this book down. I think my biggest issues with the Stormlight Archives are that we have so many characters and we're bouncing back and forth between all of them that we're not able to give any one character the kind of depth and attention I feel like they were getting in earlier entries of the series. So what this leads to is we have a wide cast. We have varied character issues. We've got all sorts of trauma that we're dealing with through the lens of the different characters. We have representatives from all the different factions of the world and all the different countries. But what is lacking is that character depth. I feel like the characters, especially in this book, were handled without any kind of subtlety at all. One of the reasons for this is there's a lot of telling in this book. There are a lot of moments that come down to these big monologues that the characters make, these speeches that they give, and they are just too on the nose. There's too much showing and not enough telling in the book. This is also indicative of another problem that I feel like the books are slipping further and further into, which has been commented on a lot of different videos, in that I think Sanderson has gotten to the point where he's so big and so successful that no one is willing to tell him no or to not do something. And even if they are telling him that, he doesn't have to listen to them. They're going to be successful and popular, and he's going to sell 1 million copies. There is a lot of discussion online about the degrading prose as the series goes on. Not that it's bad, just that it is trending more and more toward mainstream. Some people have described it as like YA feeling. I definitely feel there are elements from this title that are not working as well as it was early on, when we only had a couple of different characters to jump between. And again, I think it's a combination of the prose becoming a little looser and the cast becoming too inflated, where we don't get the time to really ruminate on the characters and have them develop in ways that are believable and organic, and instead have to have these kind of ham-fisted speeches that tell you how characters are feeling or tell you the lesson or message you're supposed to take away from it. And I think that that's a shame, because I think earlier on in the series we were getting a lot more of that more nuanced character and more dynamic introspection of what's going on in their lives. Another issue that I've talked about before is I just don't feel like these books need to be as long as they are, and that problem is compounded because of the simplified prose. I have a book that feels more simplified, but you have so much more of it, and so there are really long stretches of this book where I feel like not a lot happens. action plays out very meticulously and very slowly, and like most of Sanderson's books, you get the best bits right at the very end, and they were really good bits. They were really strong. This book had a really cool ending, but more and more the question I get, the feeling I get when I finish one of these books is like, was it worth reading 1,300 pages for 250 pages of like really exciting moments, and then the majority of the book being like just slogs, and seeing these characters get beat down for books and books and books on end. This is not supposed to be a grimdark series, I don't think. It's supposed to have hope, and it's supposed to be uplifting, and it's just, you don't get a lot of that, and it drags. It's dragged for books and books at this point. One other concern, and it's not really an issue for me because I've read a lot of other Cosmere books, but Stormlight does really feel like it's moving in the direction of being like Cosmere central for the books, where there are references throughout this title of all these different characters and these different forces and these different worlds and these different gods. And I feel like if you aren't reading outside of Stormlight, if you just wanted to get the high fantasy story, these scenes would be really distracting, confusing, and I think a little bit aggravating, because again, the prose moves so slowly that these are not short scenes. There's a lot of world building in the book, which I will get to in a minute, and that's also like Cosmere building, and because of that, I could see where that would be a negative for someone who is just wanting to focus on this world and these characters. And yes, there have been nods in Mistborn books, but not to this level. I don't think they're nearly as distracting. Plus, again, with Mistborn, I think the longest book is like 500 something pages. Maybe the last one was 700, maybe. And it's very much centered on a handful of characters, and so those nods I don't feel are as distracting. They're not as lengthy, and so I think they're more digestible. I made mention in my Rhythm of War review that there's a lot of technical information here about the magic system, that we go to great lengths to scientifically explain exactly all the minutia of how the science works and how fabrials work and how this one device they made in its prototype stage and then its using stage, and like how everything, little detail works. If this is the science textbook of the Stormlight Archives, then Wind and Truth is the history book. And if you are a fan of world building and a fan of like epic fantasy realms, then I think you're going to enjoy it. I definitely did. I loved all the history background stuff. I didn't always love the way that it was presented, but I loved getting the build up of a lot of things that have come before that have been hinted at. I've liked getting the full picture of what has happened on Roshar that has always been hinted toward and like kind of teased at. And in this book, we definitely get into the nitty gritty of the entire history of the planet. So that's a lot of fun, and I liked that a lot. I felt like Kaladin and Szeth's story was the most intriguing initially because they are traveling into a part of the planet that we have not seen before. And that was all really cool. And to see Kaladin's reaction to how alien this part of the world is was a lot of fun. Szeth's backstory stuff is really strong, I feel. But I that did degrade over time, and I felt like the end of that story was not as entertaining and not as interesting as I had hoped it would be. Strongest character in this particular book was Adolin, and his entire arc was built upon what had come before in what I felt was a more natural way than some of the other characters. Where he ends up is, I think, the what I was hoping most of the book would be, like a good place, maybe not all sunshine and rainbows, but like a positive place to be. Dalinar is the next most interesting, but there are some issues there as well. And surprisingly, as much as I love Shallan and enjoyed seeing the developments that she was going through, I felt that she was given some of the least amount of time in this book, which I guess is kind of appropriate because her and Kaladin really did kind of reach their peak and turn a corner at in Rhythm of War. And so I could see where her story is more focused on more of that world building, but it does read as kind of going through the numbers a little bit and also teasing at things that I don't think needed to be prolonged as much as they were. I like the varied characters. I like the different perspectives we're getting, but because we're jumping around so much, I don't feel like any of them develop very strongly. I also feel like character flaws are a difficult thing in this book. The characters think that they have flaws and that they have problems, but if you look at them objectively and the actions they take, we have a very like strong, like highly moralistic band of characters, with the exception of Dalinar, which I think remains one of the most interesting characters with that inner conflict that has been developed through the series so far. Conflicting thoughts with this one. I was kind of going back and forth. It ended very strongly, so again, it ends up at that 4 out of 5 stars. I'm going to now talk about spoilers and talk about specifics that bothered me and things that I did rather enjoy. So if you don't want spoilers, just go to this part of the video. We're going to start off with Kaladin because the problems of Rhythm of War are back and they are worse. Kaladin has invented therapy within 10 days of this thought entering his head of, hey, maybe we shouldn't isolate people who are struggling mentally. And they use the word therapist. He says at one point in the book, he says, I am this character's therapist, and it broke me out of the book so hard because that concept doesn't even exist. I'm not a fan of where Kaladin ends up. I don't think that was well set up or well projected. It just kind of comes at the end and he's like, oh yeah, I'll become a herald, no problem, I'm here, I can endure pain. That's kind of my whole thing. But again, so much of that arc of Szeth and Kaladin ended up being like these grandiose speeches. I don't know, like it's not that I want all conflict to be resolved with like fist fights or with, you know, magic powers, but also I think it's kind of it kind of is ham-fisted the way that these like moralistic ideals are pigeonholed into this story. It's even worse with Dalinar because we go from Dalinar. His whole thing is like learning the history of Roshar and learning about what happened to Honor. He briefly ascends and feels like all the pain of everybody around him. You know, he gets that kind of godlike awareness, and we have this prose about like, we have this constant refrain of like doing the best for the best amount of people and like caring for others and having empathy, and we go from that to like a battleground of the heroes just like trying to murder as many people as they possibly can because they're in the middle of a war. And so that messaging is really really undercut by going from this like moralistic stance of we need to understand each other, we need to understand the enemy, and we need to find a way to compromise and like build trust, to like this battlefield where it's like we need to just kill as many people as we can and get out and have our big one-on-one battle. That's how Adolin's story ends up, is this one-on-one fight in a throne room. And I think we were cutting between Dalinar and that fight, and it was just like so it was such a dissonance, it was such a difference in tone and in messaging that was also just a weird that's a weird decision to make, to bounce between the two of them. Shallan, I felt like existed just to fill in the gaps that a lot of people had already guessed about her mother being one of the heralds, and when she killed her, when Shallan killed her mother as a child, she briefly went to I think is it Braze, and then like immediately broke, and that's what sent all the heralds back and they got the fused back and started the desolation again. And I feel like this one is unfortunate in that it was already predicted and was a pretty strong prediction. Sanderson does not have a poker face when you call him out on like specific information. And I feel like it was teased throughout the book too much. There's too much of this like, oh, I can't go back and face my past. I can't face what happened. And then like, oh yeah, I'll face it, but like in a little bit, I need to wait a little while, and then finally facing it. And I feel like I honestly think that kind of mentality, that kind of that kind of approach to storytelling is really what a lot of these books are, is like we have to think about what we're doing and then talk about our plan and then enact our plan, then the plan goes bad and then this happens, and it's just all these like little tiny steps forward, and you're bouncing between all these characters. It can become very frustrating and very disorienting and distracting. Shallan mostly existed in this as a vehicle for plot description, and I find it I find it odd that Sanderson himself has talked about how with your writing you have characters and plot and setting, and fantasy is a weird genre because setting is what defines fantasy, but it should still be the least important thing in your writing. The characters and the plot should come first, and I feel like at times in this book that was not the case, especially the chapters from Honor's perspective. These are pure info dumping from a deity. They're just like, lo, I was a god 4,000 years ago, and here's exactly what happened, and it's just a bunch of telling, chapters and chapters of telling you backstory for the book. And I feel like there had to be another way. There had to be a way to tie that better into characters. It comes to a point where Dalinar can identify with things that are going on, and then he takes the power in. So it intersects with character and it intersects with plot. But in the moment, in those chapters, it's just, here's the setting. Here is how the world works and all the details of it, and I'm just going to info dump it for an entire chapter. That was a problem. I didn't like that. And again, I find it odd because Sanderson talks explicitly about not doing that in his lectures. A lot of telling in this book, the big speeches, the chapters with Honor, just a lot of people just flat out like philosophizing and moralizing, just talking about their stance and their worldview explicitly rather than showing it with their actions, or being having more finesse with it, being a little bit more indirect. I kind of missed that from the earlier books. The biggest problem, though, this is my number one biggest issue, is I feel like with the cognitive realm specifically, there were some moments in this book that felt like gotchas, that felt like rug pulls, in a system, in a world in which we have, explored the magic system extensively and like in great detail. And we've had thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages to express how the world works and how the different realms work. So specifically what I'm talking about is Gavinar being in the cognitive realm for the same 10 days as Dalinar, but living 20 years. I felt like that just came out of nowhere. Like, I didn't know you could do that. And you could argue the Gavinar thing was foreshadowed when they talked about how you can experience time in a different way than what's happening in reality. But when everybody else returns with about the same amount of time, and you kind of have this sneaky, like, ho, I did a switcheroo on you, it still feels like a rug pull. Also, the way that it was explained made it seem like cognitively the time would pass, but not the actual, like, aging of your body. And that is not what we saw when at the end of the story. So I still hold that is trying to pull a fast one with the rules in order to have this tense conflict at the end. Even worse is like, oh look, there's this being, this idea within the cognitive realm that, like, because Dalinar talked to him once, he is now like touched by reality, and I can just pluck him from there. I can pluck this version of the Blackthorn into reality, and he can be my soldier. And I was just like, no, you cannot be doing this, where you've explained the rules so specifically and so explicitly throughout your story, and then try to pull gotchas with the magic system. It read as like, just for the sake of the plot, we needed to have this happen. And I wish there had been some way to hint that was possible. Like, even having something where those didn't feel so disingenuous. Like, it felt like it was another point in the book that really pulled me out of it and was like, I'm reading a plot. This is happening because we need to have a Dark General for Odium moving forward, and we can't be Dalinar, because Dalinar is dead. So those just really irked me. However, I did really like the gambit that Dalinar took. It took me a while to come to terms with it. It took me a while to get used to it. I do fear that having it be the entire Cosmere is now looking at Roshar, and like we're setting up for this like interplanetary war to be the second part of the Stormlight Archives, really. I feel like that's going to be off-putting to some people who don't want to explore outside of Stormlight Archives. But for me, I really liked that, and I thought that it was an appropriate ending. It did feel like we reached a conclusion. Without that, it would have really felt like, what was the point of watching this particular iteration of the cyclical nature of Roshar? Because the desolation happens, they fight back the Fused, the Heralds get sent to the other planet, and they lock down the Fused, and then once they break, it starts all over again. The cycle continues. There needs to be something new about this iteration, and outside of Dalinar's gambit, there really isn't anything. The Heralds go right back to Braze. There's a little bit of a caveat there, again, just like magic they pull out of nowhere. Oh, we can make a little realm where our minds will be separate from our bodies, and so it'll feel like a paradise even as we're getting tortured. Again, this felt like it was another moment that really broke me out of it. But I digress. Like, that's the same. Now there's a global storm instead of just a storm that goes around the world. Now there's like a global perpetual storm, so that's even worse. So without this choice by Dalinar to free Odium of those oaths that he made, force the Cosmere to face this problem that they were trying to ignore for so long. Without that, it would have really felt like, if that wasn't in place, this really would have felt like, why are we reading this iteration? It's the same thing as every other iteration that they've described. So I'm glad that was there. That was cool. Liked that a lot. I liked Adolin's story and how that ended up, because it was our one major victory, and that is something that I feel is sorely lacking in this series that, again, I don't think is intended to be grimdark. We have precious few victories, and it started grating on me in book 3, and it's just continued, where like you've got to have wins, you've got to have good things happen, or else all your messaging of last stands and like doing the right thing and being moral and being on the right side, it's just going to ring false and be really, it's going to be a real downer if we don't start getting some good things happening. So, yeah. So those are my thoughts. Like I said, it ended around a 3.5. I'm rounding it up to a 4. I still feel like it is a good series. I love the world building. It's very fortunate that I love the world building, because I feel like that's what a lot of this book was. But I just don't. It's not hitting the way the early books were. I still think book 2 is my favorite, and I'm hoping we won't see another Stormlight Archive until 2033. But I'm hoping when that happens, we start getting some more. we start paring it down and getting a little bit more focus in on the characters we really want to develop for this second arc of the series. And that's going to do it for my review today. I know that I overall came down sounding negative on this book. It has a lot of problems, and I want people to be aware of that, but I do still really enjoy it. I love the world building. I identify with some of the characters. I just wish that some of these issues were addressed, and there were some things in this book in particular that were just incredibly frustrating. I hope your reading journey is going well. Let me know in the comments down below if you've read Wind and Truth. What are your takeaways from it? Were you happy with how it ended up? Do you feel like it was a satisfying conclusion? Are there things that you wish would be improved, or for you, is it the perfect book? And until the next one, take care.